Today I would like to present my research that I conducted over the last 4 years here at the University in Bonn. It's about integrated robotic learning and planning for UAV-based information gathering in unknown environments. And let's first have a look at a few applications of UAV-based information gathering to get a better feel for the topic. So UAVs, or unmanned aerial vehicles, or also drones, are used nowadays in quite a lot of applications. For example, we use drones to monitor agricultural arable fields. For example, we could equip such a drone with an RGB camera to monitor the field and, based on the acquired imagery, identify in the images where crop and wheat are located. Also, drones help nowadays to detect wildfires. So we would detect or deploy the drone in a large forest environment, and the drone is tasked to A, monitor the environment, and B, if a wildfire occurs, locate the wildfire and track it. What you might also have seen before is that drones can actually help in post-disaster situations and so-called search and rescue situations. For example, imagine there is an accident on the ocean and you need to find the victim within a certain number of, or a certain time period. Their drones can help because they can cover vast areas in quite a little time. And last, you may also want to use drones to monitor cities or urban areas, for example, for urban planning use cases. Here, it would be interesting for the human planner to know where buildings, vegetation, trees, and streets in the city are, to then do the downstream planning. And all of these applications nowadays are either done by a human operator actually steering the drone with joystick, basically, or with a software in which you can pre-plan a flight path, and along the static flight path, the UAV would then gather information about the environment, depending on what's your mission goal. And ideally, what we want to have in the future is more robot autonomy, meaning the robot should decide on its own in any of these unknown environments what to do to then successfully finish the mission. And for that, the drone needs to gather information. Let's first have a look at what is actually required from a robotics perspective to bring this autonomy to a robot, or here to the drone. Let's first consider the simplified example. Someone gave you this office floor plan, and you know where your drone is, and you know where the human being is that you eventually want to rescue. The drone is equipped with a sensor. It can monitor its nearby surrounding, and it's now tasked to find the human being and navigate towards it. And navigating in this sense, in this simplified example, is relatively easy. You can plan the shortest path to the human being that you should rescue. And this is called point-goal navigation in robotics. So the task of figuring out how to move from a start position to a goal position. However, if you think about the applications that I showed to you before, we also want to have the capability of deploying a drone in an environment that it doesn't know beforehand, maybe because it's deployed for the first time in this environment. And then the situation would change. We would either only partially or not know at all anything about the environment before we start our mission with the drone. So the question changed from how to go from A to B to actually where to go next, to then along this path where you want to go, collect new sensor measurements, delivering new information about the environment. And this is what we call now targeted exploration. And on top of deciding where to go next to acquire new information, we also need to respect so-called mission budgets of our drone, because the drone actually has a limited battery lifetime. Or if you think about the search and rescue mission, maybe you have only so much time to find the victim because of cold ocean water. So you need to effectively decide where to go next to gather the most information valuable for your mission goal. For example, finding the human being in the ocean. To realize such a system, you would again equip your robot with a sensor delivering sensor measurements and with the so-called state estimation module. The state estimation module next to the remaining mission budget would also deliver to you the position of the drone in the unknown environment. And as we know, for each sensor measurement, the position, we can now build on the fly a map of the environment, storing what we know about the environment up to the current point in time. So we can actually perceive that way the environment. And now, based on what we perceived already or gathered as information about the environment, we need to decide where to go next, to move on and have the possibility to gather new sensor measurements, thus new information about the environment. And this decision is done by a so-called path planning algorithm. This path planning algorithm essentially reasons or tries multiple future candidate paths that the drone might take. And for each of these future candidate paths, you want to answer the question, how valuable or useful is it to fly along this path and gather information? And how useful the information is that you can acquire along such a path is estimated by a so-called utility function. And then the path planning algorithm would take the next path that is possible, which maximizes this utility for the overall mission. And if we know now where to go, we can then deploy what you saw before, the so-called point-goal navigation and figuring out how to go there. So to gather information valuable for the mission, of course, we need a good path planning algorithm to decide where to go next and efficiently within our mission budget constraints collect these information for the mission. But also, if you think about missions such as the urban planning application, we are not only interested in gathering, for example, RGB images of the city for urban planning, but also we want to semantically interpret them. We want to know in the image where is a building, a potential tree, a street, and so on. So actually, for this raw sensor data, we need to semantically interpret it with the so-called perception model to actually make sense of what we see with our drone sensor. And for the reliable information gathering, obviously we need a well-performing perception model. So for the urban planning use case, imagine you have such an imagery of a part of a city. And the final product should be what you can see on the right. For each pixel in the image, we want to know what is the semantic class of this pixel. For example, in white, you can see that there is a street. In dark blue, you can see there are buildings. In green, you can see trees and so on. And to actually deliver now such an autonomous system, what we would like to do is we would deploy our drone in the initially unknown city, record an image with the camera, and then associate exactly this semantic information to each pixel of the image. And we do this usually with so-called data-driven machine learning or deep learning models. These deep learning models are trained on a large training data set that you would, for example, collect in different cities and give all the collected images of these different cities to a human annotator, which then in a very tedious process analyzes and annotates all pixels in all collected images. But because now you deploy your drone in a new environment that you haven't seen before in a new city, what actually happens with your perception model, it would predict such semantics. And you can see clearly that in the bottom part, it predicted the wrong semantics for the incoming image. Why is that? Because of the new environment, you might actually now collect images that are too far apart or too different from the training data set the perception model was trained on. And this leads to these perception or prediction errors. So to ensure good information gathering with the drone, we now need to ask, hey, how can we actually adapt the perception model towards this new environment and improve the prediction quality of the perception model? So to tackle these problems, before I started my PhD, there were already these path planning algorithms that actually decided where to look next to do targeted exploration. However, these path planning algorithms were rather slow. So the UAV needs quite some thinking time to decide where to go next, which is inefficient. Also, there were quite a ton of different path planning algorithms for very similar information gathering algorithms. And secondly, from a perception model point of view, how to improve it, there were two different paradigms of algorithms that you could use to improve your perception model in an unknown environment. The first is what we call supervised methods, which rely on a lot of human labeled data, which is very costly to annotate. So the second method would be so-called self-supervised methods, which do not rely at all on any human annotated data. So they are definitely less costly. But as we also will see later, for our drone monitoring applications, these methods are usually yielding subpar performance. So my thesis contributions actually cluster around these two observations. First, I propose new path planning algorithms for targeted exploration of drone missions, and these make use of so-called reinforcement learning algorithms, which then enable to cut down on the thinking time during a mission where to go next, so you can more efficiently decide and explore the area that you want to explore. And also, I proposed a new unified formulation for very related and similar information gathering missions, such that based on this unified formulation of all these different but similar problems, you can now deploy a single path planning algorithm to solve them all. And for the perception model improvement side of things, I present a new path planning algorithm today that lets you decide where to go next to collect useful new training data to improve your perception model. And I also will present today a new semi-supervised method for perception model retraining that does not need so many costly human annotations to actually retrain your perception model. So today, we only focus on how can you actually improve the perception model performance in an initially unknown environment. So let's start with how we can actually use path planning for this. So I propose a new system which makes use of the following idea. You deploy a drone in an environment and you have a path planning algorithm which decides where to go next. And at this next position, you want to collect, or you do collect, a new RGB image. This RGB image is then passed on to a human annotator, which annotates the semantics of the image. You do this until you run out of emission time, for example, a limited flight time. After you gathered this training data, you now retrain based on this annotated data your perception model, which then improves in performance. You redeploy your drone, you then collect new informative training data to iteratively basically improve your perception model until you have a desired performance. Let's first have a look at how it's done at the moment in industry, basically. So you would deploy your drone, and the drone would execute a so-called coverage or lawnmower-like pattern. So it really goes from left to right, up, down in a very symmetric pattern and collects along this pattern new training data. This is not so efficient because maybe in larger environments, your flight time is not enough to cover the whole area. And B, it might not be the most useful training data that you collect sequentially along this path. To see this, let's first suppose that your perception model is tasked to only identify buildings. And you see now this black rooftop building, which you haven't seen before in your training data set. So you need to annotate the image first to then retrain the perception model and then be good at finding these black rooftop buildings. However, in a second deployment of the drone, you now encounter such red rooftop buildings, which you again haven't seen before. So you might need to annotate and retrain before you can then reliably detect this red rooftop building. And now you could say, okay, now after this annotation process, I actually can identify all the buildings in my city reliably with my perception model. But actually you can't maybe, because in the bottom left, you might encounter a residential area in the city, which has a changing geometry of houses, which your perception model hasn't seen before. And this example shows us that the informative training images for a perception model are spatially distributed across the environment, so it might make sense to target these clusters of information. And B, it's not so easy to quantify which property of an image actually makes it useful for considering it for perception model retraining. So the first question that we need to answer is what makes an image actually useful for perception model retraining? And to answer this question, we draw inspiration from current methodologies in so-called uncertainty-aware deep learning. And we start with a standard convolutional neural network that takes in on the left an image and should produce on the right a semantic prediction of this image. And we adapted slightly by adding after each of the orange convolutional layers a so-called dropout layer in pink. And what a dropout layer in a neural network does during training is basically for each layer in your neural network at random, shutting down some of the neurons in the neural network. So only the neurons here in the white circles on the right that are not crossed out contribute to the overall semantic prediction of the neural network, only this part. And we exploit this and say, hey, we can not only do this during training, we can also apply dropout during so-called model inference. When a new image at a new mission on the fly comes in on our drone, we want to do the inference on the semantics. We use this trained model, but again, apply dropout multiple times independently. So different parts now of the network contribute to different individual semantic predictions. And this is in literature called Monte Carlo dropout, and it has two benefits. We can A, now average over the individual predictions that our neural network made and get a more stable final prediction. And B, we can also analyze the spread of these individual predictions. And the higher the spread, the more uncertain the model is about its prediction. You can also see this effect qualitatively. For example, imagine on the left an image is incoming during flight, and you make this prediction in the middle column. And next to it, in the error column, you can see in the rightish areas, the areas where the prediction was actually wrong. And in the most right column, you can see in the yellowish areas, the areas of the prediction where the model is uncertain based on the Monte Carlo dropout computation that I showed you before. And you can see that the yellow and the white parts align relatively nicely, such that qualitatively, we might say it could be good to analyze model uncertainty as a proxy to the usefulness for model retraining. We can also see this quantitatively. So here on the vertical axis, you can see an evaluation metric which basically reflects the perception model performance for the semantic predictions. And on the horizontal axis, you can see an increasing number of these Monte Carlo dropout forward passes that we execute, over which we then average. And you can see in orange lines the standard deep learning practice of doing a single inference pass, a single forward pass with all neurons, versus in dark blue, the method that we propose to use, the Monte Carlo dropout. And clearly, using Monte Carlo dropout improves the perception model performance. But also crucially, it improves the so-called model calibration. And to understand why this is important, let's first consider in the left figure what model calibration is. The blue area in the left figure shows what a perfectly calibrated model is. A perfectly calibrated model would tell us, I'm 50% certain that there is a street in the image. And then on an independent test set, 50% of the time, this model would be correct. However, what happens usually in deep learning, in standard deep learning, is what you can see in the red area on the left. The model would tell us, hey, I'm 70 or 80% certain that there is a street in the image. However, on the test set, it's only 50% correct. So it's overconfident in its prediction. And this difference between the red and the blue area on the left is measured in terms of what you can see on the right, on the vertical axis in ECE, the expected calibration error. And the reduced error here in dark blue shows that we can actually reduce the calibration error of our perception model using Monte Carlo dropout, or the other way around, the model calibration of the model itself improved, which means that we get more reliable uncertainty estimates about the model prediction, meaning we can more reliably probably quantify if this image is useful for model retraining or not, using the uncertainty that we estimate. So how does this work now in a real pipeline? We would deploy the drone in such an environment, and for each incoming image, the drone would use the perception model and Monte Carlo dropout to predict the semantics and the model uncertainty of this image. And because we know the position of the drone in the environment, we can stitch together and update these two environment maps that we built. The semantic maps hold the prediction of the perception model, plus the model uncertainty map hold the uncertainty estimates that we just produced before with Monte Carlo dropout. And then based on these maps, we can actually plan a new next path along which we want to acquire new training data. And for this, again, the path planning algorithm that we now propose is working as follows. We sample at random many future paths that the drone might want to take, here depicted in circles connected with dashed lines. And for each of these candidate paths that the drone might want to take to collect new training data, we need to evaluate the utility of this training data along this path. And for this, we propose a new utility function. And this utility function, A, measures the model uncertainty along the path, which you can directly read out from the just built uncertainty map. It also measures the training data diversity by remembering for each pixel in the environment map how often did it already occur in the training data, and by giving it a small exploration bonus to also foster the drone to go towards not yet explored areas, which are depicted in the bottom left in this light gray shaded areas. So how does this now work in practice on our urban planning data set? We have again here on the vertical axis the perception model performance, and on the horizontal axis this time the number of images that a human annotator had to label. And we compare 5 different path planners that all have the same maximum flight time to spend in this city. But because all these planners differ in how they collect the training data, they differ in how many images were annotated. In yellow, you can see the standard practice of doing this coverage lawnmower-like pattern. In purple, you can see a prior state-of-the-art planning algorithm for this problem. And in the 3 other colors, you can see different flavors of the path planning algorithms that I proposed and I showed to you on the previous slide. And you can clearly see that for a given perception model performance, our path planner requires less images to reach this perception model performance. So overall, the human annotator had to label fewer data, so spend less time or cost on actually getting the same perception model performance. Or to put it differently, if you as a human annotator are willing to annotate a fixed amount of images, then you should use our path planning algorithms to collect this data because you get and end up with a better perception model performance. So what you saw until now is that you can and should use adaptive informative path planning to then get this training data. And you should steer the path planning algorithm with principles from uncertainty-aware deep learning. And overall, this leads to a system that integrates robotic path planning and practices from computer vision to maximize the perception model performance while at the same time reducing the number of images that a human annotator has to label. However, the human annotator has to label still quite a lot of images. So what we asked next is there actually a way to reduce this labeling burden further? And we came up with a so-called semi-supervised method for perception model retraining to answer this question. Now, in this part of the presentation, the path planning and the environment map stays exactly the same as what you've seen before. However, what changes now is how we make use of this labeled and collected data to retrain our perception model. And first, what we say is it's more efficient to not label each pixel with a human annotator of an image that we acquired during flight, but only a few pixels are labeled by a human annotator that are informative for perception model retraining. And secondly, we can also make use of the semantic map that we build on the fly online anyway to generate additional training data. And then both is combined into one training data set for perception model retraining. So let's first talk about how we select these pixels for human labeling. So suppose you have an incoming image on the left during the flight and you do the semantic prediction with your perception model. And now you can see, for example, on the top left that the prediction is relatively cluttered locally, meaning for each pixel in its neighborhood, there are a lot of different semantic classes which are predicted, meaning that our perception model is not yet very well aligned in this area of the image to do a nice prediction. Or what we call here from the literature, it's called region impurity. And what we do now is we consider for this incoming image the 10% most region impure pixels, and out of these we'll sample at random just a few ones to A, reduce the labeling costs, and B, to increase the trained data diversity, which is important to get a better perception model. And to see why our pixel selection criterion matters, let's compare in dark blue what would happen with our path planning pipeline if you select pixels at random for human annotations, or if you use in dark blue our method for pixel selection for human annotation. Again, you can see on the vertical axis the perception model performance, and this time on the horizontal axis you can see different levels of pixels that a human annotator was willing to annotate, from very low number of pixels, 0.05%, to a quite high number of 5 to 6% of the pixels. And you can clearly see that with our pixel selection criterion for the regime of very low annotation budgets that a human annotator is willing to label, the perception model performance drastically increases with our method. Also, if you fix the budget that a human annotator is willing to label, for example, to 0.5% of the pixels that are labeled with a human, you can again see in dark red the performance of just selecting pixels at random, and in dark blue our method's performance. And the three other colors are other methods known from computer vision literature to select informative pixels for model retraining. And you can clearly see that our method also outperforms these other three methods known from computer vision literature. And lastly, we now want to talk about how to automatically generate additional training data, which we call self-supervised label generation. So for each incoming image, for example, the image on the left, during the flight of the drone, we remember the position from which the drone took this image. And then after a flight is done, the semantic map that we built online during the flight, we can re-render it at this position and basically read out from the map the corresponding semantic label for this image which we recorded during the flight. And then we do the same thing by rendering the corresponding model uncertainty to this prediction from the model uncertainty map. And we only focus on the 10% most certain pixels depending on the model uncertainty, here depicted in dark blue, because these certain pixels are more likely to be correct, as we showed before. And then, due to trained data diversity reasons, again, we sample a few of the 10% most certain pixels. And the effect is the following. So in dark red, you can see what would happen before with using our human selected or our selected pixels for human annotation. And in dark blue, you can see what would happen if we additionally, on top of these human annotations, now add our automatically generated labels. And you can clearly see that we consistently improve performance by adding these automatically generated labels. So to sum up, here you can see in orange what I showed to you in the first half of the presentation, use a path planning algorithm that in a targeted way collects new training data, but the human annotator selects and annotates all the pixels of all collected images. Compared to in yellow, what is also standard practice in literature, you do not use any labels, which is arguably less costly or no additional labeling costs, but you can clearly see that there's a huge performance gap to what we proposed in the first half of the presentation. And now, our semi-supervised approach that you saw in the second half of the presentation, by requiring only 1/20th of the pixels for human annotation, we can almost fully close the performance gap. So meaning with just adding a few human annotations, we can get almost the same perception model performance in our initially unknown environment. So to wrap it up, what you saw today is that we can actually use path planning for training data collection for our perception model. And you also saw that it makes sense to, in a smart way, only label a few informative bits with the human annotator and add on top in an automatic fashion from the knowledge that you have anyway encountered in your environment maps to the training data set and thereby improve the performance further. So in total, what we propose is an integrated semi-supervised path planning framework that then maximizes the perception model performance while reducing the human labeling effort even further. And if you're interested in more details of this work or also the other works that I didn't show you today that I conducted during my PhD, there are 3 journal papers and also 3 conference papers that you feel free to check out if you would like to. And with that, I'm happy to answer any question that you might have. Thanks.